Gresham College presents The Making of a Masterpiece, the opening salvo, by Professor Christopher Hogwood, CBE.
Good afternoon. Welcome to you, and welcome also to the Wilhelm String Quartet, who are going to play a complete Beethoven String Quartet later on in this production. I would just like to link what we're doing today a little bit with what I was talking about in the last lecture last month, where I was getting very excited about the originality and the uniqueness of Mozart. That's the Amadeus effect. And we talked a lot about a wonderful individual mind and a very original and unique solution to problems and this sort of thing. And you heard the devilish tricks of the Mozart oboe quartet. The logical follow-up, I think, to this is really to put the more business-like side of the picture of musical composition and a career as a composer, certainly in the 18th and the 19th centuries. It's not so much the business of being a total original. It's more like jumping on a moving bus that's already underway, and you have to jump on with some aplomb to make people notice that as an extra passenger you are worth looking at. If you remember the statement by somebody I've not been able to pin down exactly, someone did say once very effectively that the painter who paints a tree is not doing so because he wants to paint a tree or because he has seen a tree. He's painting because he has seen a painting of a tree. And it makes a big difference, I think, to the working life of a composer, getting to grips with the fact that you have to join a train which has been in motion for some time. The originator of the string quartet, most simply, although not completely accurately, would be Haydn. I think everybody plays Haydn string quartets as a usual starting point, and so he gets this cosy title of the father of the string quartet. He drew on what was already available, but produced such a body of string quartets that they established that this was an important unit, and it's remained ever since that time a very important unit of classical music composition, along with the opera, the symphony, the sonata. So the next person along has to do something pretty amazing in order to join this moving vehicle. And that was Mozart, of course, who turns up in Vienna. It's about 28 he was when he first arrived. He goes and studies fugue and a lot of the earlier tricks of composition from the more pedantic teachers in order to add these qualities to his already very effective, very theatrical compositions. And some of the things he first produces of note will be a set of string quartets which he obviously has to dedicate to Haydn as the father of the string quartet. Well, that then gave us all the Mozart quartets, and next to arrive, curiously, at about the same age, 28, in Vienna, comes Beethoven, who was doing exactly the same thing, looking back at the legacy of the string quartet as it had been established and played by amateurs and professionals and published. And he saw, as Mozart saw, that there was a need to have terrific classical grounding, almost baroque grounding. You had to really know harmony, counterpoint. You had to learn how to include the characteristics of learned composition. And so fugal moments, if not complete fugues, and it's quite clear all Beethoven's life he was struggling with this ogre of the baroque fugue and how it could be reclaimed for classical music. The Grosse Fuge is one of the last great pieces he wrote, again with string quartet in mind, that is stretching, some people say bursting the bounds of the strict definition of fugue. But Beethoven took contrapuntal lessons and then decided when he'd worked on a set of quartets, he would show the world what he could do in this established form, which means immediately, as soon as the Opus 18 quartets appear, they are compared with Mozart before him and with Haydn before that. Beethoven was quite a practical man of the world. He didn't dedicate his quartets to either Haydn or Mozart. He dedicated them to Prince Lobkowitz, who was going to pay him heartily for writing them. And he also took great pains to make sure that the first quartet, the thing that the customer would first look at when they opened the volume, was a stunning piece, and one that reflected what he thought music could and should be doing, and spelt out for the public why his quartets and his attitude to music, and in fact the 19th century view of music, was going to be so different from the 18th century concept. In fact, the quartet which opens this set of 6, Opus 18 number 1, was not the first one to be written. In fact, it was the second one he wrote, but it was the one he took back from his friends who he had shown it to in manuscript, and said he could improve it now. He'd had more lessons, he had really learnt what the tricks were of writing suitable music for a string quartet. And he wrote particularly to one close friend saying, do not on any account show that copy of the quartet that I gave you to anybody else, because I have now completely reorganized it, and now I really feel I'm on the way of understanding the string quartet. Luckily, his friend didn't show it to anybody else, but he did keep it, and so we do have the ability now to compare Beethoven's first idea with his much corrected, much rethought version, which is the quartet that we're going to hear this afternoon. In the process of the rewriting, you can see quite a lot of what Beethoven was trying to do. He's trying to tidy the piece up academically. He's trying to increase its contrast and drama. He felt that, I suppose, there might be a danger that the string quartet audience might nod off. So he made sure that there was tension. He made sure that there was a certain degree of obsession and relentlessness. He didn't let you get off lightly. Once Beethoven hits on an idea, you really know he's hit on that idea. And it doesn't have to be a very big idea. It can just be ba-ba-ba-bum. But he certainly lets you know that that little unit is going to do as much work as any much bigger, longer lyrical theme that other composers had used. And another important aspect, I think, of his introduction into the quartet world was the fact that he immediately told the public that he had aspirations beyond just the musical meaning of what he was writing. This was not entirely abstract music, but it was music, as it were, abstracted from bigger literary or philosophical ideas. I thought we'd introduce you to a few of the moments in the quartet so you can see how the balance of power works. And the first thing I think it would be nice to show would be the slow movement. That's the second movement, which is actually the longest movement of the quartet, and one that he described to his friends and let the public know was, he said, based on the tomb scene in Romeo and Juliet. Previously, composers had not usually admitted to what their background source was for inspiration. You don't find Haydn, even though there are many nicknames added to his quartets. They are not the story of the quartet. They're merely a little tag, a label that you can attach to a quartet, so you remember which one you're talking about. The sunrise, because of the shape of the tune. The fifths, because of the harmony, this sort of thing. But in Beethoven's case, he didn't call this the Romeo and Juliet quartet, but he did say that the slow movement was not a blow-by-blow translation, of course, but it was founded on the ideas that you would have while seeing the tomb scene of Romeo and Juliet enacted. So it brings in very, very big concepts of doomed love, of feigned death, of genuine death, of tragedy, of sorrow, of life. It's Beethoven announcing, he's hardly 30, and he's announcing that in his musical world, big concepts are going to have front seats, and you might as well know it, because that is going to be the underlying philosophy and explanation of the status and the stature and the sheer size of these movements that he was writing. Doesn't matter that it was only 4 string players who had been previously very used to playing elegant quartets by Rococo and classical composers. This was a life and death matter. You remember in the last lecture we had this little problem Mozart solved of how to let the oboe be the prima donna of a group that was supposed to be 4 equals. The idea, I think the nice idea of a quartet is that you're all equal. Beethoven goes along the same sort of road when he opens the slow movement of this, and you can see there's the gloomy sound of the accompaniment, and there is definitely one prima donna, be this Juliet or whoever, lamenting over the top. Maybe we just hear the opening of this movement and you see immediately the picture that Beethoven is presenting, and the fact that one instrument is clearly top of the heap in this composition. At its most tragic. And the melody that you heard from the violin is not going to be exclusively the violins. It's a solo lament for sure, but other people can take the solos, and it very soon you'll find passes over to the cello. And then drama erupts. So Beethoven not only sets this gloomy, tragic solo song at the beginning, but everybody can get very, very worked up. Big things afoot, and this is the central moment really of this whole quartet. Carry the program in your mind, because Beethoven was hoping that you would, and expand on it. The end is as you might expect, everybody dead. The whole of the quartet, though, is not a tragedy, nor is the whole of the quartet picturesque. It's not a sort of pastoral symphony. You can't add a program to everything that's going on. But you still can gather the intention of Beethoven in the abruptness of what he gives you. You're forced to follow him even when you feel he's becoming manic. The very beginning of the movement, this is the first thing that the people would have seen and heard when they picked up this volume of music, is such a tiny motto that you can't really call it a theme. It's just a lunatic idea. That's all it is. And if you isolate that, it's a little turn. It's 2 notes really, tam, pam, and you just make a little turn, ti da 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 dum, just like the spring sonata, ti da 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 dum, pam. But coupled with the interval, the rhythm that he won't let go of, ti da da dum pam pam, that little rapid 2 semiquavers. It permeates practically the whole movement, and once he gets into his mind that he must prove that he is a fugal writer, he's as good as any of the Baroque, then what you get is a a complete mosaic of this idea being thrown around from voice to voice, absolutely equally, but you, in the end, you sometimes get the feeling, is he going to ever get this idea out of his bonnet? He's so obsessed with this little figure. It's something you could say that Beethoven learnt from Haydn, because Haydn was probably of all composers the most economic. He could run an entire symphony on an idea that consisted of just 2 or 3 notes. But in Haydn's case, he does a very clever sort of television cookery act. He takes the ingredients and then he is so clever in their redistribution and chopping, cooking, colouring, reformatting them, that while he smiles at you, you can hardly believe that the whole of this great meal has been made out of such simple ingredients that were there in the first place. Mozart, of course, was a different sort of cook. He didn't let you see the cooking. He produced the dish in the kitchen, and then he came out with it. And there's a great deal of look at me with Mozart, and you're not supposed to inquire into what went on. Backstage, the kitchen scenes are out of sight. Haydn, for me, is an extremely attractive composer in that he invites you into the workshop, smiles, and shows you how it's done in a way that no other composer dared to be so transparent. Beethoven sort of takes the look at me concept from Mozart, but throws open the kitchen door very wildly and introduces you to all the stuff that he's got there, that he's going to play with, and says, well, whether you like it or not, this is going to be your meal for the evening. And you might look at it at first glance and think, this is pretty insubstantial what he's dealing up here. It just evaporates. The beginning of the last movement, for example, follows exactly the same policy as the opening movement, in that he shows you this wispy little flourish, out of which almost the entire finale is going to be created, including, again, fugues and a lot of contrapuntal treatments. But the beginning is so disarmingly simple and insubstantial. You wonder, can you make any sort of meal out of this whatsoever? Again, it sticks in your mind, I think, as much for the rhythm as for the notes. It's just like pa-pa-pa-pum. It doesn't really matter what those notes are, because if you just go, everybody knows what it is. And those running triplets, the little filigree that opens the piece, they can in fact occupy any notes on the scale. They often do. They run in different directions. But I think you always feel there's this rhythmic family connection. And so Beethoven works on that. And it means you can exploit then a rhythm with different notes attached, or familiar notes maybe with a different rhythm attached, and there is still a germ reference point, and it's the construction of these tightly argued movements that makes Beethoven's ability really to extend this form to as long as he really wants to keep going, because you can't really let go of the argument until he has delivered the final blow. Between the tragic slow movement and this effervescent finale, he obviously wanted the finale to be quite a showcase, because one of the things we see in his rewriting was this similar movement that he wrote in its first version he called allegretto. And I suspect that if you saw allegretto, you'd go diddly 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 bom, bom, bom. And much too likely he wanted a much more manic version of this very insubstantial little piece, and so it's a tiny and a flimsy idea played real fast. And I think that allegro that you now have and played like that is exactly what he was after. It's a slight contradiction between content and speed, but that's really Beethoven. Between the slow movement, though, and this finale comes where Haydn and Mozart would have had minuet and trio, Beethoven has his up-tempo scherzo and trio. Same thing, it's exactly the same formal patterning. He can't break many bounds here because you know you have to have a scherzo, you have to have a trio contrasting with it, and you'll always go back to the scherzo again. But what he does do is surprise you with what he can make out of a rising figure. The scherzo basically just goes up a scale, I think, doesn't it? But it has phrase lengths and accents which are not at all what you would expect. It's not the normal 4 bars plus 4 bars, but he sometimes has 5, sometimes 7. The accent is not always on 1, 2, 3, but it's sometimes 1, 2, 3. And sometimes 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And so everything, I would defy anybody to dance to it, and I think it was a great idea that he stopped calling it minuet and called it scherzo. But you see how disjunct it feels amongst the edginess of the characters. One could interpret it in many different ways, but give us just the opening as you've got it. So it's ta-da-dum, 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 rising scales on the whole, trills where you don't expect them. Trills are normally a cadential figure. Here they're on the run. Set against that then, a trio. Obviously you're not going to have scales in the trio because the scales have been worked to death in the scherzo. The trio exploits something which is actually rather, I would think, unidiomatic to a string player. It's not easy on a stringed instrument tuned in fifths to play octaves, and this trio features this bouncing figure rather irregularly patterned as the main item of it on its menu, and it's not a natural string player's thing, I would say. Let's see what we think. Playing octaves is not, I am right in saying that it's an awkward thing, and it's awkward for tuning, isn't it? Those are the basic ingredients. I think before we plough into the full feast, let's just divert one moment onto the business of a quartet, because we've run through Beethoven's contribution to this quartet. What is this quartet's contribution to the quartet? How do you, when you first decide when you first decide that you will play a work, how do you choose which work? Or when you become a quartet, how do you decide what your name will be? This is, you might think it's funny that 4 ladies are called Where is Wilhelm? Why this name?
The first quartet that we ever played in this format was a Mozart quartet, K575, and it was actually written for King Wilhelm of Prussia at the time, who was a distinguished cellist, or at least he thought he was, and he demanded Mozart to write a very tricky cello part. And that's where we got our name. Then Hetty had to play the cello part.
So one can expect everything you choose will have a substantial cello part in memory of Wilhelm. He apparently was quite a good player, I think, because I mean, clearly he wouldn't pay good money to have something written that he then fell off when he played it. So he must have been able to play those ones. But it's noticeable that Beethoven does exactly the same, I think, as well. He gives really fair shares and quite a lion's share to the cello. But when you then settle down with Opus 18, number 1, what do you come armed with, other than, I'm glad to see, an urtext edition? So at least you arrive with the right notes and the markings that Beethoven put, not disguised by somebody else's markings. So you can arrange your own bowing, or? I
think we do try to stay as true to the score as we can, and we try to do as many of the original bowings, however difficult we may find them. But I guess the general thing is making sure the articulation is completely the same, unanimous for the whole quartet. And it's very tricky. We have found it in terms of intonation as well. It seems a very sort of clean. You really hear absolutely everything. It's very exposed, we found, in this quartet.
Does it make a difference to the way you approach the slow movement, the fact that Beethoven let on it was in his mind were ideas of the tomb scene in Romeo and Juliet, or if he hadn't said that, I guess it wouldn't make much difference to the way you play?
I think it helps a lot, knowing that the tragedy, obviously there's such tragedy in it anyway, not knowing that, but it does help because there is an element of changing whether it's in 3 or in 9, and it changes whether it's going to be tragic or just a beautiful melody.
Yeah.
So I think it does really help knowing that.
It gives you the courage of your convictions, I guess. Yes. Now, I always wish there was more composer commentary on their own music. You know, Brahms is a great problem, I always find, in this respect. He was so reluctant to say anything about his music and what it meant. He just said, play it beautifully, that's all that matters. But I mean, that's not a great help to people who are agonizing over, well, like this Beethoven scherzo, you know, is it humorous? Is it vicious? Are those octaves meant to be nasty octaves, threatening? Or is it sort of scherzando? You know, what level do you pitch it at? And the finale, is it meant to be very slight? Or is it meant to be, you know, more of a mosquito sort of effect, you know, threatening filigree, these sort of things. And even when he gets obsessive, I sometimes think it would be nice to know, did he have at the back of his mind a literary format, or was he presenting some poetic or some painterly scene in this first movement? You know, the little motto theme is one thing, but everybody always asks, what does it mean? Well, it only means what it says. You know, if you could translate it into words, you wouldn't bother writing a string quartet. So it's really music beginning where words leave off. But you can, I think, sense the logic of it, which is almost a verbal logic as it goes. Do you debate a lot, or does one person just tell you what to do? This is the other great thing about quartets. Do they love each other, or do they all travel on separate flights and not speak?
No, there's a lot of debating as to where the phrase goes, where's the climax, what's important, what's a compliment, where we should take time, where we shouldn't, things like that.
And who wins the debate?
I think mostly it depends on how many people we've got agreeing with that.
Very democratic.
Oh, that's a very, very David Cameron principle. Now, there have been very famous quartets where, because of some event or other, not only they wouldn't travel in the same transport together, but we've heard of the Hungarian String Quartet, where the first violin would only speak to the cello via the viola. So she would speak to her and she would pass the answer on. And still you can get fantastic music. It is really strange that music doesn't seem to have to involve friendship at all. The same as, you know, Beethoven was by all accounts a most difficult, dirty, smelly, horrible character to get on with, but full of marvellous thoughts which portray themselves, you know, under his command in this sort of music. So it's maybe we're just as well that we only know the literary secret of the slow movement, and the rest is remains an abstract musical mystery to us. The whole quartet, if you like. Bravo.
information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.